Good morning. We'll continue our studies in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 9 onwards. Paul has already said to us that celibacy is not meant for all unless God has given the gift. Even so, even for marriage, that one should be careful when he considers or she considers marriage, because marriage involves fulfilling marital duty. It involves mutual submission. It's also a commitment to each other. It requires fulfilling of the marital vows. So one should be considering before one gets married. That's why it is necessary that we should undergo a premarital counseling. Paul actually emphasizes one very important factor, that it is not only woman submitting to the man, wife submitting to husband, but also husband submitting to the wife. It's a mutual submission that is necessary in the marriage. So one should be aware before one enters into a relationship of marriage. Today he is talking about, in verse 8 onwards, regarding the unmarried and the widow. He says in verse 8, "It is good for them to stay unmarried as I am, but if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion." Burn with passions. It is not right for an unmarried or a widow or a single to have a sexual relationship with somebody, a married man, or having an illegitimate relationship with some other without any marriage. Premarital sex or extramarital sex is a corruption. It's an immorality that can bring chaos in the society, and it is not a good way to live a life. Then verse 10, he says, "To the married I give this command, no, not I, but the Lord, a wife must not separate from her husband." Now regarding divorce, he says, not I'm specifically talking about what Jesus has to say about divorce, but this is what I think is right. Paul says this is what is right for the society, and he emphasizes 3 times saying the word must not divorce, must not divorce, must not divorce. Look at verse 11. "And a husband must not divorce his wife." Then at verse 12, he says he must not divorce her. Then verse 13, she must not divorce him. In Jewish culture, mostly the men who will divorce the women. Husband has the right to divorce women. But in Greco-Roman culture, even the woman can divorce. So I guess in Corinthian, we had a cosmopolitan church membership where both Jews and non-Jews were there. And so Paul saying neither the husband nor the wife must divorce, because that is not the way that a person can, should live a life. Divorcing to marry another woman is an actually adultery. So that's why there is no room for divorce. That you divorce a wife which is older and marry a younger woman, that's an adultery. That's according to Paul, what he's trying to say. Verse 14, he says, "For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children should be unclean, but as it is, they are holy." I would like to read from South Asia Bible Commentary what Dr. Finney has written. He says here, remember, from the Jewish context that Paul is writing, whereas the Pharisees would have emphasized that a pure person is defiled by contact with someone who is unclean, Paul, the converted Pharisee, knows that holiness too is contagious. The power of God can work through the believer to claim and transform their household. Thus the household is sanctified through the believer. So Paul is saying that for the unbelieving husband, if the wife is believer, he is sanctified and his children is still clean and pure. So it's not necessary that when a non-Christian husband and wife, if one of them become Christian, it is not necessary that they divorce the other one just because he or she is unbelieving. On the other hand, verse 15, where in verse 15 Paul says, "But if the unbelieving leaves, let him to do so. A believing man or woman is not bound in such a circumstance. God has called us to live in peace." In case one of the member as a couple, one of them become Christian, so the non-Christian wants to leave. If he or she wants to leave, you should not hold it. You should not bound them, but release them so that your relationship remain in peace. Do not bind them. In the first century, normally if a person divorces, he has to return all the dowry that has been collected before the marriage. So in other words, Paul is saying if one wants to leave, you should be willing to pay back all the dowry also and let him or her go in peace so that you continue to hold a good testimony in the society. Verse 16, he says, "How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband?" If your husband is unbelieving and he is uncomfortable to live with you, how do you know that by staying with you, he will become one day believer? If he wants to leave, you should not divorce, but if he wants to leave, let him go. So also, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? So exactly the same way, even if the unbelieving wife wants to leave, let her go. You should not divorce, but you should not bind her to stay and force Christianity upon your wife. So that's the message that Paul has for us for a complex situation of a marriage and marital relationship. May God help us to learn from Paul's writing to the church at Corinth and apply in our day-to-day church today, because human being is the same and the complexity remains the same in our churches. But we need to go deep into the Word and understand what Paul is trying to say and what the Bible has to say for our today's life. May God bless you. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.